Welcome to the Green Alliance podcast. We are the charity and think tank dedicated to achieving ambitious leadership for the environment. I'm Holly Brazier Tope, Director of Politics at Green Alliance. The UK has made impressive progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions since passing the Climate Change Act in 2008, meeting all three of its carbon budgets so far. These budgets set targets for total greenhouse gas emissions produced over a 5-year period, and they've been steering the UK towards a low-carbon economy. The UK is now over halfway to achieving net zero carbon, and it's driving growth, with the green economy growing in value 3 times faster than the wider economy. As part of this, the government faces a number of legal deadlines, by which time it needs to produce a climate action plan, laying out their plans for what they think is a credible pathway towards a lower carbon economy. However, both of the previous 2 climate action plans have been ruled unlawful by the courts for failing to demonstrate sufficient detail on how targets will be met, and the deadline for the most recent plan was the 29th of October 2025. It came, you guessed it, on the 29th of October. Labelled the incredibly catchy Carbon Budget and Growth Delivery Plan, the latest plan included a number of documents, including a broad narrative talking about the necessity for action on climate and nature, a huge document laying out the calculations for how the government think they'll meet the targets across different sectors, an investor prospectus aimed at providing certainty for businesses about the UK's commitment to the green economy, and a methane action plan, laying out the importance of action on methane emissions specifically. To make sense of all of that, I am thrilled to be joined by Sam Alvis, Associate Director for Energy and Environment at think tank IPPR. We've been waiting a long time for this climate plan. Why do you think it matters? Why do you think they're significant for UK climate strategy?
Yeah, I mean, 2 judicial reviews and 2 failed plans are always going to push back the deadline a little bit. I think, first of all, it's important to say, given that the last 2 plans were deemed by the courts to be insufficient, they weren't going to adequately address the carbon emissions that government needs to find, that it's worth reiterating the easy out would have been for a new government with a massive majority to say, well, given our inheritance, you can call it an emissions black hole if you want, all the stuff that we've got to make up from previous governments. Actually, we think we should probably look at the Climate Change Act, make some tweaks, make our lives a bit easier. They didn't, in fairness, they didn't do that. They said no, despite the fact that we've not had the progress that we perhaps needed on climate emissions and the difficult politics of carbon reductions at the moment, we are going to stick to the carbon budgets as recommended by the CCC, the Committee for Climate Change, and we are going to find a way of making that work. So, yeah, despite the wait, we got our carbon budget delivery plan this week.
Obviously, I alluded it to in my intro, but the UK has met all of its carbon budget so far. What do you think, just looking back a bit, has particularly enabled that success?
So I think without making it into a smaller thing than it is, the initial carbon budgets have very modest reductions in emissions, right? And predominantly they are about cleaning up your energy system. Now, there are a bunch of historic reasons why the UK energy system was less carbon intensive, and that is in large thanks to Margaret Thatcher and her various interactions with the coal industry over time. And you can have your own view on the politics of that, but it did a great deal for carbon emissions. Since then, and in fairness to them, various iterations of the Conservative government building on the Climate Change Act in 2008 then continued to decarbonise our power system. And in particular, they really supported the rollout of offshore wind as a major power source. That has by and large done most of it. There's 2 other important factors that are worth knowing. Across the world, over that period, the Conservatives were building out renewable energy demand growth was broadly flat. So we were replacing almost 1-to-1 with new energy coming online, retiring carbon intensive emissions. We weren't having to find new generation to meet new demand at the same time. And we were also doing a lot on improving energy efficiency. So predominantly when we think of energy efficiency in the green sector, we think, oh, putting a load of insulation in your house, all of the energy efficiency measures that government tends to support. But what we're really talking about here is actually the things that we have at home or in businesses that use energy just got way, way better. So your fridge, your dishwasher, etc., were just so much more efficient. And that contributed to that flat demand growth, but it also actually contributed to real emissions reductions as well.
You've alluded to obviously the fact that it is multiple, it's many different governments and different political parties of different stripes that have kind of enabled that to happen. So I think it is generally agreed that meeting climate targets has been possible because of the cross-party consensus on the need to tackle it. Obviously, we will get into the politics a bit more, I'm sure, but that consensus has all but broken down in the last year or two. What do you think that means for action in the remainder of this parliament? So setting out some of the context for which this plan is now landing.
Yeah, and there's two reasons to remember why the political consensus was important. The first is to actually pass climate legislation, like the fact that so few people voted against Theresa May's increase in the emissions reduction targets, for example, is testament to that. And that makes obviously the passage of actual policy easier. But the second is if you are a business looking to invest in something related to the clean energy transition, the idea that no matter which party gets in at the next election, broadly the plans are going to be the same is very good because your time horizons for that investment are significantly longer than the parliament. So actually that political consensus made the UK a very good destination for investment. So what does that mean for emissions reductions this parliament over this carbon budget? Well, on the first, the Labour government still has a massive majority. If they want to pass any primary legislation or secondary legislation to enact carbon emission reductions, then great. They can go ahead and do that, and they will do. On this political consensus translating to business sustainability, it's a bit more wobbly. Now, there have been a load of technical changes to the way we procure infrastructure, the way we manage energy infrastructure that is designed to give industry and private investors like that long-term certainty. And I think they will help. So things like the formation of NISTA, the 10-year infrastructure strategy, like all of this really matters to energy investors. Like, remember, these investors they're not climate NGOs. They're investing because they see that as the future of infrastructure, not necessarily because they're like, all that matters is the emissions targets. So we've still got those structures in place. But the problem with reform polling where they are at the moment and the Tories going backwards on net zero is if you look at 2029, you're not entirely sure as an investor what's going to happen to your clean energy investments. So that's where the political consensus is potentially having a chilling effect, even if, and we must always remember this, that political consensus fracturing has not meant a public consensus fracturing.
Definitely. I mean, well, government clearly understand that risk as well, right? And that's why one of the documents they published yesterday alongside the plan was this like investor prospectus, so aimed completely at like providing certainty to business. When we have a parliamentary system that is only a 5-year term, do you think that they are in a position to provide enough certainty for businesses, or do you think that the cross-party consensus is actually, the key problem with that?
So it's really hard, and I do think the investor prospectus is a really interesting and helpful document. And like, to be honest, at this stage, what it is mostly doing is signposting to the more granular policies in other places that investors will care about. But if we look at one specific example of where you need to get investor money in, and that's the CFD scheme. Now, the CFDs are an annual auction that has inherent risk attached, and that will give you now a 20 years contract. So there's two ways of looking at it as the government, and it basically depends on your hedging of political risk. Do you step up now in the view that, well, if we're not around in 5 years, what comes after might be worse, and try and get all of that investment in the door as soon as possible? And that is one way of reading Clean Power 2030, is like, we need to accelerate action in something which has got very viable business returns, industry is very interested in, because that will create a legacy that no government afterwards is going to undo. But that basically relies on the assumption that whoever comes in next isn't willing to tear up a government contract. So the risk, I still think, is relatively low, even if the noise is high. But the real impact of that is that what businesses will go is like, okay, well, if we need a 20-year return and we know for 5 we're fine, we need to price that political risk into our costings elsewhere. So you might start to see a slight increase in the cost of capital, which means we manage to procure less, which means our emissions reductions are lower. We haven't seen that really come through yet, and it's probably minimal compared to the other cost rises we've seen, but it's definitely something that industry should be thinking about, I think.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, obviously, we've touched on a little bit that the fact that actually in this plan is sort of a combination of all of the things that government have laid out since they came into government, right? But do you think that there are enough examples in there of how we can improve people's everyday lives, so through housing and transport and jobs? Is there enough of a vision that can combat some of the stuff that will come from media and other political parties in terms of pulling this plan apart and saying that, we're trying to get people not to fly, so people won't be allowed to eat meat and all of those things? We know those stories are going to come. Is there enough of an alternative vision on the opportunities of what could come?
It's a really good question. So part of me wants to say there is plenty in there. I just don't necessarily think it's the job of the carbon budget delivery and growth plan. I might have got the ordering of that wrong, to do all of that signalling, because the carbon budget delivery plan, and remember, it's quite late now because of the two failed plans, should be, here are all the things that we are already doing because of our various policy incentives to accelerate emissions reductions. So you're not looking at that plan to do lots of new things. But you're right, the messaging is really important on like what is the individual consumer benefit of that. But that comes down to the communication of those policies when they are enacted. And like we're saying this and having this conversation a few weeks before the budget, energy prices are still really high. And if you ask the public, what do they care about? They only care about one thing, and that is their energy bills. And for good or for ill, government is beholden to a promise it made to reduce energy bills. And I think like people will really, 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 really care whether they meet that or not. But the public doesn't look at climate policies and go, that's the stuff. Even with the political consensus fracturing and reform putting out anti-messages, they still don't believe that it's climate that's putting up their costs. So you just need to bring down those costs to maintain public satisfaction and give yourself the space to do climate policy. But you shouldn't be marking all climate policy on the delivery, like what it's doing for individuals. Where I do disagree with the plan, I wrote about this for Green Alliance in 2020, 2021, but we keep on falling back on a jobs narrative. And I get that, like, it's important to have the unions on board. Like, government likes to talk about jobs. It does not move people one iota on the salience of climate and the need to tackle climate change is saying that there are going to be loads of jobs. And there are many reasons for that, but the fundamentals are they've been burnt before by a Boris Johnson government promising lots of jobs which didn't materialise. And even if they feel comfortable enough to move job in a current like economic climate which is not conducive to that, they do not see these new jobs as being for them. And they don't necessarily need to, right? Like the labour market is millions and millions of people, and we are talking about still a very large number, but 400 to 600,000 people. And what I worry is by prioritising jobs numbers, you either don't meet those jobs numbers and you failed on an additional promise as well as doing stuff, or you do and you're employing so many people that your technology is uncompetitive with, for example, China, which has entire factories where they employ not a single human. Like, if we really care about the growth message and therefore the low cost message to individuals, that is in contrast, direct contrast to employing lots of people to do those things.
Oh, there's a lot to unpack. So you talked about the budget, which after the climate plan is like the key thing everyone is waiting for, right? In the kind of ENGO sector and also like businesses, etc. How do you actually take it as a positive thing that things like the Warm Homes Plan have been delayed to that moment in the hope that there will be some kind of bigger plan for energy bills and something that is more tangible to the public in how this can like interact with their lives?
I mean, delay is never positive. I think because of the benefit the various warm homes plans policies will bring to individuals, it would have been one of the first things I would have done as a government. And ideally, I would have done it before doing anything about winter fuel payments. But we're not in that scenario. It's good. They quite reasonably had to wait for the spending review to work out that they're still going to get their promise. And we are talking about some very, very hard, very fractious policies here around the uptake of heat pumps, right? So it's not good that it's delayed. It's good that they're going to get to the right answer. It now coming out after the budget, I do think probably makes more sense in the grand scheme of things than its original date, because if the budget is going to do direct energy bill support, that is going to have a material impact on the policies that you build afterwards. Because if your goal is to build up cohorts of people who are seeing real bill reductions for different reasons, you want to know what the budget has done either for the majority, or if you're doing some debt forgiveness or whatever that picks out a certain group, then you probably want to tweak the different policies that you're doing in the warm homes plan to say, well, actually, we're doing this slightly differently now. It does mean, to bring it back to the carbon budget plan, that is a big, you've just got to trust us that this is going to be fine. And depending on what the budget does, right? So say you look at some of those policy costs, or you look at energy efficiency, like there's lots of things that you can look at that might reduce bills. Those policies also have material impact on emissions reductions. So you'll need to take that into account, because the Warm Homes Plan now has to meet the test of the carbon budget delivery plan that you've already put down.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you also touched on the feelings of the public and like the fact that climate action is still incredibly popular. What is your take on the fact that arguably it is reducing salience, and that, you know, Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch and others are seeing that as an opportunity to really jump on this anti-net zero kind of bandwagon? How do you think that interacts in the broader kind of political and media picture in which this now lands?
One of the things that was very important for this government to do, and one of the reasons, like to go back to what we said earlier, is they moved towards the support, not punish, when it comes to climate policies, is the people in government who tried to write the failed version of this plan are now looking out for every reason to criticise it when it comes out. And look, there's a lot of news going on, but the plan came out on a Wednesday afternoon, relatively late in the afternoon, and it was an amalgamation of lots of existing very good policies, and it didn't make a great splash. And I think given how they brought it out, that was probably what they were trying to do. Like, you are avoiding what is quite conceivably a political risk and an attack point from opponents. And that is a bit of a shame. Like, we always want governments to be leaning into climate as a way of boosting support and showing they're doing things. But I think it's clear, it's like, they, despite the fact it was a huge political risk, they still stuck to it. They knew that they would be attacked on various reasons. They've done their best to avoid that. They've changed tact. And as far as the news I've read this morning, they have not been. Like, it's not been something picked up by opponents in the media or gone big on. On the public opinion more broadly, so like I say, there's one metric of public success for when as it relates to like energy, if not climate, is like, does it bring down my bills? The second, and I think the thing that I worry we've lost since, say, 2019, 2021, when this stuff was really popular, is we are chasing so many co-benefits of climate action that we forget what the original benefit was, is avoiding climate impacts. And the thing that the public really cares about, and particularly like reform-curious Labour voters, is that they're just worried about a lot of stuff, and they're worried about flooding, and they're worried about extreme heat. And I do think government still misses a chance to remind people, yes, we're doing this because it's going to lower bills, or yes, Sharon Graham and Gary Smith, like union leaders, we're doing this because it's going to create loads of jobs. But there is a fundamental reason that we're doing this, and that is to avoid the devastating impacts of climate change. And that is how you continue to bring the public with you, because it is, yes, there is support if you ask them, but it is low salience. Government has a huge, huge megaphone. It has the ability to raise salience for stuff if it wants to. And I think raising the salience of climate impacts is a really good way to really amp up what is now a dividing line and show opponents to climate action as a threat to the way of life that Britons are currently experiencing.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. Let's hope the government are listening. Um, I mean, you talk about how the plan came out. It did come out, fairly quietly. It was pretty under the radar. It was sort of led mostly in part by Katie White, the climate minister, not even by Ed Miliband. People had called on Starmer to, do it himself. Whether that was ever realistic or not is by the by. Do you think Starmer going to COP is a big enough symbol that the whole of government is committed to this ambition?
I think there's loads of symbols that this government is committed to action, not least that they brought out like I said, they brought out the plan in the first place. They have a very ambitious NDC, like the nationally determined contribution, which is our emissions reduction pledge to COP, which Starmer himself fronted. Like that is wonderful. And then you're right, going to COP backs that up. Now there's loads of reasons you go to COP if you're Keir Starmer. You're most effective and like popular when you're doing like big important things on the world stage. Brazil is a very important partner. Like that's great. And I just think the other thing is like, you look when this government flounders, which is not the rarest of occasions, they turn around and go, what is a positive story that we can sell? And more often than not, that is Ed Miliband putting solar on something. And like, that is the most fundamental, that showing that they are committed to climate action. And you're right, like Katie White, the climate minister, brought out the plan yesterday. But given it was an example of political risk management, we know that a lot of this stuff gets attacked because of Ed Miliband's history and reputation, not necessarily the policy detail. So I actually think distancing himself from it and him remaining the person that announces really good stuff is politically makes a lot more sense for the government. Like that division of responsibilities and roles like really works for them, and they used it well.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, as a final question, looking ahead, and it's something positive to end on, if we think about the next sort of 15 years or so in which this carbon budget plan has been announced, looking at a long period of time, 2037 feels like a very long way away. But both environmentally and economically, if this plan succeeds, what do you think the vision is? What does society look like?
This is a great question because for the listeners, I am expecting my first child in December. So what is very weird is knowing at the end of this carbon budget, he will be 12, and is absolutely bizarre. But I mean, there's many reasons that we work in this, right? And like, not to sound like the political hack, but the number one thing that the public care about climate impacts is protection of future generations. So actually, that view of what society is going to look like has become materially more important for me than it was. What do I think the world is going to look like? I'm going to start with what the world is not going to look like. And like in 2037, despite what the Daily Mail might tell you, people will still be going on holiday to Spain, and they may occasionally even eat a steak. Like this is not this is not full totalitarian veganism at that stage. What you will see is like none of your mates are going to have a petrol car, right? And chances are your home is almost fully electrified. You've got solar panels, you've probably got a battery. Your energy use is either in the charge of the company, like your energy supplier, just making that a bit easier. But your bill is definitely lower, not necessarily because the wholesale price of energy has come down significantly. Like we can't predict that far out in advance, but your electric tech is making stuff a lot easier for you. Then the bit that I'm really hopeful for, I think, is just that like the stuff that can make life just feel a little bit hard in Britain just gets that bit nicer and easier. Like one of the things in the carbon budget plan is really incorporating all the stuff that we're doing on land use and the importance of green space, clean air, the building out and restoring of woodlands and peatlands, etc. It's just going to be some nice places to go, and that's going to be lovely. Like broadly, 2037 does not look like the revolution that some people will tell you it's going to be, for good or for ill. It is just makes Britain just like a much nicer and easier place to live, I think. And it's just like those little small things that will just improve people's day to day. And I think that's the most important thing for us to focus on. You get around easier, your bills are slightly lower, there's some lovely green space around the corner.
I want to live in that 2037. Let's hope it comes. Thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
And lovely to be back. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Keep checking in as we'll continue to bring you specialist interviews and highlights from our events here on your podcast feed. You can subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and you can follow us at Green Alliance UK on X and Green Alliance on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. We encourage you to use the hashtag Green Alliance Podcast to join in on this conversation and share thoughts, questions and ideas. See you next time.